Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. This is episode 5. I'm your host, Thomas.
And Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, we've got big plans for us today.
Let's hear it.
We are going to go through all 139 sections of the FIA rulebook.
Oh, Jesus, that sounds exhausting. How about this? Or, since we have so many new fans like us,
Sure.
what if we just explain what Formula One is?
What F1 is, I like it a lot, and it's probably going to be a lot quicker and easier than reading the whole rulebook.
Maybe we'll save the rulebook for a later date.
Yeah, so we introed in a couple of episodes how we're still relatively new to Formula One. We've been in it for just about a year now, a little bit more since we watched the entire last season, but maybe a year and a half now. And it took a long time, I think, to get just to where we are now. And it would have been really nice to just sit down and listen to somebody explain what the sport is in not the most basic terms, but pretty basic terms.
Yeah, learning on the fly is pretty frustrating.
Yeah, because we'll sit there and watch races and you're like, what are they talking about?
No idea.
No, what is degradation?
How about chicane?
Oh, no. So things like that. So we wanted to get into the foundational elements of Formula One and hopefully use this as a catalyst into all the other topics that we're going to talk about in the future, using this episode as like a reference or a base. So Jeremiah, how are the teams structured in Formula One?
So there's 10 teams. Each team has 2 drivers for a total of 20 drivers. Now, granted, there are test drivers, there are reserve drivers, but if we're talking about who lines up on the grid on Sundays, it's 20 drivers.
Sure. And when he says grid, just F1 terminology, we're talking about the 20 guys that are lined up to start each race. That is the grid because they form a grid. It's simple enough, but you might not know. So yeah, you've got the 10 teams, 20 drivers. They each have a team principal.
Mm-hmm.
Some are known for their personalities. Others are known for being in the shadows.
Some are known for their dog in them.
Who would be a dog team principal?
Dude, there's only 2. There's 2 dogs that are team principals. You've got Christian Horner on Red Bull and Toto Wolff on Mercedes. That's it.
The 2 winners.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you would think teams like Ferrari, McLaren, Alpine would be up there, but their people are just more in the background.
I feel like that's my, don't come for me, but I feel like if things, like Ferrari could have a great team principal, but if things don't go by Ferrari standards, he's gone.
Right.
Gone.
Because they're Ferrari.
Right.
Okay, so we got the teams and the drivers and principals. There are a varying number of races in a year, right? The races used to be single digits and they moved into double digits. Last year we ran 21 races.
I believe so, yeah.
And then this year on the schedule there's 23 races, although it's iffy if all 23 will be ran.
I feel like I remember something about one of the tracks not allowing for big gatherings like that yet because of the country that it's in. I don't remember the
Possibly
name.
China.
I want to say it's one of the Asian races. I think it's either Japan or it's China. It's one or the other.
So maybe we'll get 23, maybe not. And of course, there's now 3 U.S. races, which is new. And so where do we typically see the races in Formula One?
Typically, you're going to see those in Europe for the majority of them, just because that's where the home of F1 is. That's where it started. That's where all the team bases are pretty much located, is somewhere over in Europe. We have a couple over in the United States. Well, now 3, actually. 3. And then some in South America, too.
Right. So you have Brazil and Mexico. And then tying back to the whole Europe thing, I think 6 of the teams are based in England.
Yeah.
Even though there's only one English or British Grand Prix, there's 6 of the teams there. So just when you're looking logistically at flying all these people around, it makes sense to have them in Belgium and Netherlands and things like that.
Right. Which makes it very hard for people like us to have jobs
Right.
for a team in Formula One, unless you're willing to pack up and sayonara all the way to Europe.
And then you also have the issue now where we're getting the U.S. races, but because they're like a new toy for the U.S. market, it's $4,000 to get into the Las Vegas Grand Prix, which is ridiculous. But yeah, so they're mostly over in Europe. And then whenever we're looking at race length, this is what makes the sport so accessible. So the races are like 90 minutes on average, right? Give or take a little
About,
bit.
yeah.
And then there's a max, right, to the time that they can race.
Right. So if they go longer than they don't, first of all, they don't. At 2 hours, it cuts off.
Right.
Whatever lap they're on, you finish that lap and you're done.
So as soon as the race starts, they start a big timer somewhere. They don't show it until they get to that point.
Right.
But if you have red flags, which mean a race is stopped due to an accident or some kind of weather situation or something like that, timer keeps ticking.
Yeah. Yellow flags too, whenever the cars have to slow down. So laps are taking like 3 times as long as they normally would, 4 times, 5 times.
If they determine that the race is safe to resume at whatever point during those stages are, whether it be yellow flag, red flag, whatever, you have whatever time is left.
Pretty
could be
much.
10 minutes, could be 20 minutes, and you might only get a couple laps in. And then sometimes you'll see half points awarded, which we'll get to points here in a minute. But I really enjoy that part of the sport, because when you look at the sports we're accustomed to, football, baseball, I mean, basketball is kind of in that area too, but football and baseball, you're talking 4 hours.
Oh, yeah. Easily.
3 to 4 hours.
Easily.
It takes your entire day to watch a game.
But then again, in football, you have scenarios where you'll have, there's only 20 seconds on the clock.
Right.
But this 20 seconds stretches for 20 minutes.
Because then there's commercial breaks, which in F1 races, as far as we know in the U.S., watching on ESPN or F1 TV, there are no commercial breaks.
I haven't seen any yet.
I don't know if they're doing, I don't think they are on Sky Sports, because we're getting the Sky Sports broadcast on ESPN.
Right.
So you're watching the race nonstop with that. Like, it's not even going small screen. It's just nonstop race,
Nonstop.
which is sweet.
You know, they do all of their ads on the barriers where
Yeah.
they put in the digital ads on the banners, on the crossover pathways that go over the top of the track, stuff like that.
Because you'll see the replay and suddenly that ad that was just there isn't there.
Yeah.
The Rolex ad or whatever it is.
Or you'll see the exact same ad plastered for like a mile on the track.
Yeah. But I think that 90 minutes thing and then the max 2 hours deal, it really helps you to just, if you're going to spend a Sunday doing something, spend an hour and a half watching a race, because it doesn't take that long.
And if you're in America, be prepared to wake up early.
Yeah, because they can start at 2 a.m., 5 a.m.
Which for them is normal. It's
Yeah.
a smooth 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 5 p.m. No, it's 7 in the morning for us.
Yeah, and now there's talks of them starting the Vegas Grand Prix at midnight or 1 a.m. Vegas time in order to get the European market during the day.
Which I understand, but
It's
you're
so
a
late.
United States home race.
Yeah.
It needs to be in United States time.
Because they ran Miami at like, what, 2 or 3 in the afternoon? It was an afternoon race.
Yeah, I mean, the Austin race is like at what, 4 or 5, something like that.
Which means you're getting the European market at 10, 11 at night. That's late, but it's not
I mean,
unrealistic.
they're not waking up at 5 in the morning. All right,
Look, man, we're putting a lot into this sport.
we're putting in the work.
Gotta set the alarms for a race.
You wake up in the morning and you're like, 10 more minutes, but then you realize, oh no,
It's starting
I gotta go.
Because when they say it starts at, 7 a.m. our time, it's starting at 7 a.m. Like, that is when they are gone. Like, they're
Yeah.
off. There's no, unless there's a weather thing, that's it.
Pretty much.
Okay, let's talk race weekends. What do those look like? How long do they take? How does the average person watch them? What are we looking at?
So for the average race, for any given weekend on a regular schedule, the path that it follows is on Friday, you're going to have your practice 1 somewhere in the morning, and then practice 2 in the afternoon somewhere, like, before, after lunch, whatever.
Sure.
After that, you're going to roll into Saturday. Saturday, they're going to start off with practice 3, or FP3, which is another terminology that they use. You have
Free practice.
Yeah, FP1, FP2, and FP3. After the FP3 for Saturday morning, it rolls into qualifying.
Right.
Where after qualifying, the cars are set, everything's locked up, and Sunday morning race. Well,
Sure.
Sunday morning for us.
For us,
them,
right.
it's a normal time.
Yeah, normal time. So whenever we're looking at practice sessions, this is the team's time to no longer use simulations or computer models. You are putting car on track and seeing how it performs, not only in the weather and the climate, but also the track material or surfaces are different everywhere around the world. And so they have to see how their new Pirelli tires are working, how the
That's another thing too.
how the car's aerodynamic package is functioning and all that. Maybe they rolled out an upgrade package that weekend and they want to test that out. So that's what they're doing in practice. And how long are the practice sessions?
Ooh, I'm not 100% sure. Was it 30 minutes, I think?
Is it 30 minutes or an hour?
It could be an hour.
Okay, I'm going to look that up. What happens in qualifying?
So for qualifying, it's split up into 3 individual sections. You have, Q1, Q2, and Q3 is how they say it.
Right.
In Q1, there's a set finite amount of time, and we will get back to you on what that time is. After that, they have... or not for qualifying one, they have 20 cars. The bottom 5, the slowest 5 drivers are dropped. So as it goes into Q2, you now only have 15 cars. After Q2, the top 10 drivers advance. Again, the bottom 5 are dropped. So you go into Q3 with your 10 drivers, and how they lay out at the end of the time, once everything is all said and done, that's the way that it is for the actual race on Sunday.
Yeah, and I've got a couple of points on why I love qualifying. But to clarify, the practices used to be 90 minutes. They're now 60 minutes each.
Oh, so they shortened them.
They shortened them.
Interesting.
Which gives the team less time to prepare. The reason I love qualifying, so I got into F1 a little bit before Jeremiah is. I got him playing the F1 games and then got him watching Drive to Survive. But he got into the F1, I'll call it bonus content, before I did. He was watching the practices and the qualifying, and he was like, dude, you've got to watch these qualifyings. It's like a race in itself because it's a competition. And so whenever you broke it down like that, where you say every 20 minutes they drop 5 off for the next session, it's like a tournament style of who's the last one standing.
Let me drop a little fact on you. Check this out.
Okay.
Qualifying sessions are where all of the track record lap times are set.
Yep.
Because the tracks have the lowest amount of fuel. They're on the fastest tire, running the fastest setup, trying to get every single 100th, 10th, 1000th, whatever of a second that they possibly can. So that's when you're going to see guys flying.
Yep. If you want to go back and research one of the best laps that never technically happened, just look up the 2021 Saudi Arabian Jeddah Grand Prix, Max Verstappen's qualifying lap, trying to knock off Lewis Hamilton.
And if you want to laugh, watch Fernando Alonso's interview during that session.
But you can, to Jeremiah's point, you can see that the car is as on edge or as fast as it's possibly going to be, and you have a driver that is pushing it to its absolute limits.
Oh, dude, it's
doing
ridiculous.
Things that a computer says is impossible.
It's absolutely ridiculous. These guys are drifting to the very, very edge of the track where they barely have the slightest hint of one tire, a sliver of one tire on the track. And it's valid. It's a valid lap.
Yep. And so that goes back to when we start talking about races and qualifying. You look at the qualifying sessions. Yes, they're trying to get the fastest lap, but there's rules or measures in place to make it fair, which is you can't cut corners.
Nope.
You have to have at least one tire on the track at all times. And I know that might not make sense. How do you only have one track on the tire? When you see some of these turns, you can only have one track or one tire on the track.
But it's not just one. It's not like you have to have the full tire on there. Like I said, you can have a sliver of a hint of slightly a bit of rubber barely touching the track. And as long as the whole tire isn't past that white line, you're golden.
Yeah, and it counts. If you break that rule, they invalidate your lap time and you have to do it again. And the biggest problem with that is, like Jeremiah mentioned, the cars only have like 1 or 2 laps of fuel in them. So now you've got to go all the way back to the pit, get your car reset up and get back on the track. And you don't have time to do that.
On top of that, you lost tires.
Yeah, because you're only allowed a certain amount of tires.
Well, I mean the fact that you've already put in laps on those tires.
Right.
Those are no longer fresh tires.
No more
so
new tires.
There's no, unless you go and waste another tire compound, you're not going to get the fastest lap that you possibly could have gotten.
So let's go into the race. So qualifying, it's a winner take all situation, but if you get the fastest lap in qualifying, you are rewarded with first place on the grid. Right. And it stacks accordingly after that.
Right.
So if you drop out in qualifying session 1 of the first 5 out, you're 16 through 20, right?
That's your set position.
That's your set position. Only the ones that make it into qualifying 3 have a chance to fight for positions in the top 10. But once you're done with that qualifying session, that's where it goes for the race day.
Right, which is why we'll see teams like Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes using the hardest compounds, the tires that they just don't care about for qualifying 1 and 2.
Right.
And then in qualifying 3, that's when they're dropping the fuel, they're loading on the soft tires, and they're going to get it.
Because they just need one lap in those other sessions to get in.
Let's be honest. You could put an Alfa Romeo, a Haas, whatever bottom car that you want, throw it on the softest tire with 1 lap of fuel, and throw it in there with the Red Bull on the hardest tire, loaded down with fuel. They're going to produce the same lap.
Yeah, and so that's why you'll see Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Sergio, all those type of guys run 1 lap and just qualifying 1 and 2, and then really push it down, like pedal to the metal in qualifying 3.
If you look at their times from qualifying 3 versus qualifying 2, they take like almost a second and a half off their time.
It's awesome.
It's ridiculous.
And I've heard some strange arguments, but at the same time I get it, like, why does the fastest person not start last to help the people that are slower? Well, that's why you want to be better in qualifying. You're rewarded and therefore given, because ultimately if you start in first, as long as there's no big major accidents or safety cars or anything like that, your odds of finishing first, or at least in the top 3, are insanely high. Because if you can get away from the pack, like we saw Max Verstappen do all season in 2022, you're running in clean, fresh air the entire time.
Oh, yeah, you're not fighting anybody.
Okay, race day. For us, 5 a.m. For England, it's noon. The drivers are, like I said, it's a normal day for them. They're all there. They're in their pits and the paddocks hanging out with the team. But then it's time to get in the cars, and they start doing that roughly 15 to 30 minutes before the race time starts. You see them strapping in and getting ready and all that. And then they do what before they line up on the grid?
So you got the formation lap first. So everybody's out there on the track. You have all the cars lined up in what their position will be, but they're all surrounded by engineers. And they're sitting there, they're making their last minute adjustments. Obviously, there's limitations to those adjustments because they have something called par ferme, which means that after qualifying, whatever setup you chose, you're set. You cannot change anything. That's it. That is the package that you are running. So with that being said, they're on the track, maybe doing minor tweaks. I'm not even sure what they're even allowed to do. Like maybe
giving the driver some water.
I mean, they're not allowed to warm up the tires now.
No. Well, that's a whole safety thing that we can get into. But yeah, I was kind of confused the first time I watched a race.
And they're off?
Yeah, because you see them all lined up, and then it's like they have the 2 green lights, I think, up on the thing, right? Mm-hmm. And they start going, but they don't go very fast.
And they're going left and right and left and right and left and right.
They're swerving all over, and you're like, what is this? So what they're doing is like Jeremiah said, they had the engineers on the track, so it's a real sketchy start because there's people everywhere. They can't.
Oh, they clear off, but
but they're off on the. They're not
right there.
Yeah, they're right there on the side of the road still. And then you have them swerving back and forth, which we learned was to heat up the tires, and it does have a serious effect on the car how warm your tires are.
Yeah, it's all about grip. The hotter you can get those tires to an extent,
they stick.
They'll start to melt that rubber, and that rubber sticks to the road. Now you have more traction. But after it reaches a certain point, you're still just sliding everywhere.
Right. And so this is kind of the one place that I guess the drivers at the back of the grid, your 17, 18, 19, 20 guys, have an advantage. They can be real slow on that formation lap, warming up their tires, and make the people up at the front wait.
Yeah, because the people that are on pole position or in the top 5 really will get up to that line, and then they're just sitting there.
And what's happening to your tires during that?
Cooling off.
Cooling down.
Meanwhile, all the back marker teams are sitting there warming up their tires, and the second they hit the grid,
it goes.
Countdown.
So there are a couple of famous F1 broadcasters, but the crew right now that's going for Sky Sports and ESPN in America is David Croft and Martin Brundle. Mm-hmm. And there is a famous saying for how every race is kicked off. I'll set it up and then I'll let you say it.
All right.
So the drivers have finished their formation lap. It's race day. We're ready to go. There is a gigantic Rolex clock. Oh, no, sorry. The Rolex clock is for the formation lap, isn't it? I think so. Because
I thought it was just always there.
It's there, but it kicks down to the formation lap. So let me bypass that. There's a giant Rolex clock at every race. But they line up on the grid, and then you see 5 red lights appear on a traffic-style light ahead of the drivers. And the lights start counting down one at a time. And what happens when there's no more lights?
So, to set that up a little bit further.
Oh, please.
They all turn up they all turn on, but it's kind of like it follows. So it's like the first one lights up, then while the first one's still lit, it goes second one, third one, fourth one, fifth one, and then as the lights start to turn on, that's when you'll start to hear the engines. Everybody's revving up, trying to get to exactly what they need their RPMs to be for the perfect launch. And then lights go out, and then you have the famous tag, lights out, and away we go.
It's an awesome start, and it's every race, and it never gets old.
It never gets old. And then, of course, I'll for the rest of the day, I'll just be walking around. Oh, and it's lights out and away we go.
Because he'll kind of customize it to the track. Lights out in Baku.
I think it's sweet.
And because you have the sound of the cars, you have guys taking off that are going 180 miles an hour off the jump into turn one. Mm-hmm. And it's an exhilarating start to the race. Because usually the first couple of laps are, I'll say, generally the most exciting until you get into like the battles for positions, because the first couple of laps you're talking, what accident is about to happen here?
Oh yeah, I mean at the very beginning of the race, like we talked about, everybody's lined up on the grid, so they're right next to each other. So as you take off and you start to approach turn one, everybody is there. So you have 20 drivers dogpiling into one turn, trying to get past. So you're just waiting for something to happen.
And most tracks allow you to go 3, maybe 4 wide if you're on a straightaway. In a turn, you're talking 2 wide usually at most.
Oh, and if you're in a street circuit, probably just one.
Yeah. And so, like Jeremiah said, you've got 20 cars that are trying to get up into that top 10, which we'll get to points here in a second, but they really want to be in the top 10 as quick as possible, because once the race spreads out, you're fighting for 1 or 2 spots.
Right.
Unless you're a dominant car that was pushed to the back of the grid for penalties or whatever. If you're in an Alpine, you're not going to gain 6 spots in a race.
No.
It's very rare. And so you need to make up all that ground while everybody's piled up together in the first couple of turns of the race. Okay, so we talked about how the races, how they start, how they're about 90 minutes. We will say the laps vary by track. There is no set number of laps.
Right.
Like when you look at NASCAR, you have a 500 race, which is 500 miles, and that's also determined by the size of the track. Similar in F1, they don't use numbers to indicate it's not like the Austrian 500 Grand Prix. But you might see in Austria, they run 77 laps because it's a pretty short track. But in Spa, Belgium, they run 46 laps or whatever it is.
Right.
But it's the same amount of racing.
Yeah. Well, there's another side of these race weekends.
Okay.
Sprint races. So before you get into that, I'll let you go into that. But I do want to add, sprint races were not a thing.
No.
They had 3 sprint races, I believe, in 21. And then in 22.
Right.
So for this year, 2023, they're adding 3 more. So we're going to have 6 sprint races.
And they confused us for a long time.
Why don't you go into how the structure for the weekend on those go?
So sprint races, I don't know how they pick the track that they do these at. There's got to be some logic to it.
Random.
Like last year, I know one of the Italy Grand Prix had it.
It was Imola had it.
Imola had it, and they're different. So you have your normal race weekend, like I talked about, where you have 3 practices, a qualifying, in a race. 2 practice sessions in a day, a practice and a qualifying, and then a race day. 3 different days. When you go into a sprint race weekend, everything changes, including Parc Fermé changes. So now you have a practice on Friday of the race weekend, followed by qualifying on Friday night instead of Saturday night.
Okay.
Saturday morning, you fire up and do another practice after you've already qualified.
Interesting.
And then Saturday night, you go into the sprint race, which, how was that order determined for the sprint race?
So, whatever your qualifying is,
the qualifying.
That's how you set up for the sprint race.
So, the sprint races are, I think, a third of this. Isn't there a kilometer to it?
Right. So, they go 100 kilometers.
100 kilometers. So they go 100 kilometers, which is roughly a 30-minute race is what they were shooting for, 25 to 30 minutes. And now you have this whole jumbled mess of how do you have a practice after you qualified, because that first qualifying wasn't actually for the race. It was for the sprint race.
Oh.
It's weird.
I've got mixed emotions. I feel like it completely demeans qualifying, but that's...
It does, but we saw something last year that I know you really enjoyed. Who almost benefited from a sprint race?
Yeah, it was K-Mag on Haas, and for Brazilian Grand Prix, he actually got pole position from qualifying, which put him at number 1 for the sprint race. The problem with the sprint races, in my opinion, and I'm a year-long fan. I haven't been in the sport long, but my issue with the sprint races is K-Mag would have started one for the actual race.
The real race.
For the real race, the one that has the most point value and everything else on Sunday. And instead, because in the sprint race, the other top teams like Red Bull, Mercedes, and Ferrari had 100 kilometers to dogfight for those top positions. K-Mag drops to like 6th.
Yep. And then they start the race and he crashes. But
not his fault. Anyway.
So I'll say that I do like the sprint race for the aspect that it gives lower teams, I won't say lesser teams, but lower teams, the opportunity to compete in a race environment and not just a fastest lap. Because when you look at teams like AlphaTauri, Williams, and Haas, they are just not competitive in a fastest lap format. But maybe if you get some driver instinct going and you get some slipstream and overtake and DRS ability, they can make moves.
I can see it.
And so now you're not talking fastest lap, you're talking about a race to set up the actual race.
So weird.
So they're going to have 6 sprint races that then on Saturdays that then transition into the real race for Sunday. If we already qualified and used the qualifying for the sprint race, what sets up the grid for the real race?
The sprint race.
The sprint race. It's pretty simple to follow, but it did confuse us for a while because we were so accustomed to, especially watching Drive to Survive, the sprint races weren't really covered in Drive to Survive.
No.
You're used to practicing, qualifying, racing, not
Right.
qualifying, racing.
Right. So I will say that the sprint races, if you ever want to know what kind of changes to the structure of how everything goes down happen in Formula One, you can, for the most part, look at Formula 2. That's where they do all the experimental stuff. So in Formula 2, every weekend's a sprint race.
Yeah.
That's how they do it. They do sprint race and then real race. That's their structure.
And the other way that F2 might help you enter the sport is they are more or less stock cars compared to the F1 cars.
They still bring R&D,
Right.
which research and development.
but the chassis is the same, right? And I think the engine's the same, roughly.
I could be, I'm not 100% sure on the engine. I know the chassis is the same.
The chassis is the same. And so it's more of an even playing field, if you will.
And the front wings aren't as dynamic as they are in Formula One. It's a little bit
Speaking
different.
of, they outlawed the Mercedes front wing from last year going into this year. Just a little side note. You know how it had that crazy curve in it? Gone.
For the front wing?
Yeah, for the front wing.
Oh, I thought you were referring to the little.
No, the front wing.
Yeah.
Little side note. Okay. All of these races have to mean something. What do they add up to?
I mean, are you talking in terms of points?
Points.
Oh.
And the grander picture of the World Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship.
Right, because every single team is going to be rewarded points based on what the driver can bring home from the end of the race. And every single position up to a point, the top 10, can actually earn points.
I think the most baffled I was, and I don't know if you were the same way, if you watch Drive to Survive, highly recommend it. They follow, for the first couple of seasons, the teams like Haas and Williams.
Mm-hmm.
And you see them fighting for 13th, 14th place, and you're like, why does that matter? And then you see them in 11th place fighting to get into the 10th place, and you're like, who cares about 10th place? Because again, here in the States, if you're the 10th place football team, you barely made the playoffs, if made them at all. No one cares. But in F1, if you get 10th place, you get a point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's nowhere near what the winner gets at 25 points or 26 with the fastest lap, but a point can mean the difference in millions of dollars for your team.
Yeah, because every single team at the end of the year, based on how your team falls in the rankings, gets a certain allocated amount of funds from the giant pot that comes to Formula One. So for the first place teams, you're going to get the majority of the money, and then it goes down from there. If you get 1 or 2 points over your competitor, that puts you a whole place up. You're allocated more funds.
And you also have more sponsorship opportunities because your car is going to be shown more and have points next to it and be looked as a contender.
Everything matters.
Yeah, and so when you're watching the race, you might say, okay, the guy that Max Verstappen's far and away in first place, he's lapping people at this point, he's clearly going to win. Cool. Forget about him. He's going to win. Go watch the people fighting for 5th place because that is a battle. That middle of the top 10 every single week where you have some McLarens, Alpines, always a Ferrari in the mix.
It's one of the top teams that's always has one driver down there.
One fell back, and then you have 1 or 2 teams trying to fight up towards the top. And it's always the battle for 4, 5, 6 in a race that is followed, I think, most heavily. And it's awesome.
Yeah, I think if you're just watching the front of the race, it can tend to get boring just on the simple fact of, I mean, for example, Max Verstappen broke the record for the most wins in a single season.
15.
Does that not get a little old? I'm
It
just
does.
saying. I mean, and not old as in like you don't want to see it because you're still happy for the guy. We love Max Verstappen. We want to see him winning championships. We want to see him doing good. But I also want to see action.
Yep. And so they purposefully do the broadcast in a way that is beneficial to the watcher that watches the important stuff. And they'll put it on the battle, and they will say on the screen, battle for 7th place.
And then it highlights 3 drivers and they're just all going at
Right.
it. You watch their time differential.
If you're really into tech, they do the Amazon thing, the Amazon stats.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's just a branding thing, but it's really cool how they will say they did it a lot with Lewis, because I feel like Lewis was always hovering around 7, 8, 9, and then would work his way up towards the top 5 in every race. It would say Lewis Hamilton in striking distance of Carlos Sainz in 3 laps, and you're like, how did they?
How can you possibly know? Sure enough, 3 laps later, he's on his tail making the overtake. You're like, how do they know this?
And it's even crazier when they're not even that far back. Like if he's already starting on his tail, and they're like in 3 laps he'll be overtaking him, and then sure enough, 3 laps later they cut back to that camera and there.
Yeah, like how? Why couldn't he pass him 2 laps ago? Why did it have to be 3 later?
They just knew.
I don't understand.
Or it's all scripted.
Okay, let's not turn this into a conspiracy podcast.
WWE.
No, none of that.
No, so we like the tech aspect of it. The broadcast is great. They show you the races that matter. And I think that's another reason why the whole 90 minutes thing is great. You're not sitting there watching a guy pull away for 4 hours, right?
No.
But you can sit there and watch a battle for 7th place, which again, it's not the end of the world if you lose 7th place. But for some of these teams, if you know the backstory of the teams, which Drive to Survive shows, you realize why a Williams getting 9th place last year with Nick DeVries, or sorry, was it? Well, yeah, it was Williams. Getting 9th place was huge.
Yeah,
That was a big step up for them because they've been struggling. They used to be a dominant team. They struggled for so long. They finally get points.
it's with the reserve driver.
The reserve driver. But that's a big deal.
Before we continue on how important these points are, why don't we give them the points breakdown?
Okay.
So if you're getting first, if you come in first place, you're going to get 25 points. After that, it starts to slowly drop off. So you got
Exponentially.
right. So you got second place, 18 points. Third place, 15 points. And then it goes fourth is 12 and then 12 points and then 10 points, 8 points, 6 points, 4 points. And then the last 2 are 2 points and 1 point, which is why 9th and 10th are so important to some of these backmarker teams. Because if you're in 10th and you have a chance to get one more point, if you get 9th, you have to go for it.
Yep.
Oh, also, if you get the fastest lap and you finish in the top 10, you get an extra point. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you get the fastest lap of the race, but you fall out of the top 10, whether that be a wreck or you just get past, you're not going to get that point. It just dies. That point just dies.
I don't know when they introduced the fastest lap, but it definitely added an element of strategy to the teams. Because now if you have the race winner that is in first place, they might be more cautious of battling for a fastest lap because they're trying to hold their position. Meanwhile, if you have somebody that's in the middle of the top 10, I'll use Charles Leclerc as an example from last year. He was in 4th, 5th, 6th place, somewhere like that. And he goes into the pits to get new tires to try to get the fastest lap because the newer the tires are, the faster you can go. And he ends up not only not getting the fastest lap, but losing a spot in the race as well, missing out on more points than he would have if he just stayed where he was.
Yeah.
And that wasn't his call. That was the team's call.
Yeah.
But that goes back to Ferrari's ignorance
But
in strategy.
that works for most teams when they try
Right.
to do that. Like I remember times where when Mercedes was going, they had Lewis Hamilton winning the race. Valtteri Bottas might have fallen back, or his lead in second place compared to the third place driver is so big that it allocates enough time for him to go into the pits, throw on some softs, and get that extra point.
You only need 20 to 30 seconds depending on the track.
On top of that, your fuel is empty.
Yeah.
You have like 5 laps of fuel and fresh soft tires.
You're cooking at that point. Okay, so we mentioned the Drivers' Championship, which Jeremiah gave the points breakdown starting at 25, 26 with the fastest lap, going down to a single point. There is a team element to this. The very first thing we mentioned was that there are 10 teams with 20 drivers total, 2 each. The teams are also competing.
Yeah, you have the Drivers' Championship, which is the main championship that everybody watches because the drivers, you want to see where they face against the other drivers. But there's also a Constructors' Championship. And however many, let's say Max gets 25 points in one race, and then Sergio Perez, who gets second, gets 18 points. So Red Bull is going to get that combined amount from both drivers as their points total for that race. Yeah,
so 1-2.
So if you go 1-2, you're getting 25 and 18 versus if you go, let's say 3-4 and you're only getting 15 and 12. That is a dramatic difference.
Just in one weekend.
So it might not affect the Drivers' Championship too much just because they're only going to be back, 5, 6, 7 points?
Right.
But the Constructors' Championship, they could be back 25 points after a race.
I don't know what the history behind this is, but I have 1 year as a reference point, and I hope this kind of happens again. Usually, in our knowledge of F1, mainly when you're looking at the Mercedes dominance, the team that wins the drivers also wins the constructors. They kind of go hand in hand, right?
Yeah.
You had Lewis and Valtteri just dominating the point standings.
Right.
However, there's every once in a while a turning of the tables where you have the next up-and-comer taking over. You had Max in 2021 and Lewis tied going into the final race. Mercedes won the constructors that year.
Right, because then if Lewis, Hamilton, and Max are tied, or after the final race, Max wins the world championship, now you got to go to the number 2s. So you have Valtteri Bottas and you have Sergio Perez. Where did they fall?
Right, and Bottas had
significantly enough to not only put them ahead of Sergio Perez, but also to catch up to the points that Max had over Lewis. Right. So they made up that difference, surpassed it, and that's why they won the constructors.
And so I think those might be the best battling years when you have one team that has a driver win and one team that has a constructor wins, because that means they're pretty close.
Oh, man.
Meanwhile, you look at 2022 and Red Bull just runs away with the whole thing. Everything.
And sometimes that happens because if one driver is just winning every single race and his number 2 is frequently putting it in the top 3, he's going to run away with it.
Yep. So that is the race weekend. Let's talk a little bit behind the scenes.
Okay.
And then we'll move into our last topic of the day. These cars. The cars are all custom built by the teams. And that's why the team principal is important, because they're the person hiring literally all the people for the team and putting the pieces in place. They're running the factories back in their home states, whether it's England or France or wherever it might be. And so they build these cars custom. There used to not really be any financial limitations on it. There is a cost cap now.
No.
We will talk about the cost cap in a rules episode, but they have regulations they have to follow at least for the car.
Right.
They can only do certain things with certain design pieces that have to fit regulations.
Which is why it's called Formula One.
Yep.
The formula part is the set of regulations that they have to follow. I mean, I thought that was a cool fact when I learned
because I had no idea what that was for.
Yeah, I had no. Why is it called Formula One? And then you find out, it's a formula that they have to follow. Now, obviously, like Thomas stated earlier, it's subtle guidelines, and then it's basically like creator's magic at that point. Right. I mean, you can go in and you can change this, change that, tweak this, put a little lip over here, put a little nub over here, and all of that is changing the aerodynamics, the weight. You're talking about the durability. I mean, everything makes a difference when you're going that fast and you're that lightweight and you have that much power.
It's a lot of power in a tiny little lightweight car.
Dude.
And so when you look at the macro view of all the cars lined up, they look the same. But when you get close to them, where you see a zoomed in picture of them or a different angle, they are wildly different.
Yeah, so you'll see, for example, for last year in 2022, if you looked at the Mercedes side pods, so they just kind of they started fat and then they just dumped down, right?
Right.
But then you're looking at the Red Bull ones and they've got these big ones that go down the whole body of the car. Then you look at Ferrari.
That has the big scoop in it.
Yes. And then you look at Ferrari and they've got the 2 big flare out side pods that kind of go concave on the top of it as you get closer towards the center of the car.
And you notice their sister teams of Haas and Alfa Romeo copying that design.
You mean the white Ferrari?
The white Ferrari. So you've got the custom built cars. You also have DRS and ERS. I'll quickly hit ERS, and then if you can explain DRS.
Sure.
ERS is your energy recovery system. It's basically the battery in the car.
Right.
You can use the battery to get more power out of the car than the engine can get.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. So they can hit a little button that's like an overtake button, or it might say ERS depending on the wheel or the driver, and they will go faster.
Yeah, the only problem with that is that you can't have it on the entire race
Right.
because you can't charge the battery at the same level that you would be using energy. So they can only use it. So, I mean, not they can only use it. They choose to use it in very strategic opportunities. Like, let's say you're in first, you're on a straight, the guy behind you got a good exit, and now he's coming. What are you going to do? Hit the ERS button and make it a little bit harder for him.
Yep. Same thing with the overtake. You can do it to get around somebody if you're going down a straightaway or something like that. So you've got ERS. What is DRS?
DRS is the little flap. So on the back of every car, they have a rear wing, and at the top of the rear wing, there's a flap, and the flap can open and it can close
So cool.
with a button on the car. When that can only be activated in certain areas on the track that's designated by the FIA.
Right.
And you have to be, what is it? I think within a second from the car in front of you. Let's say, and that's not necessarily for the actual sector itself. There's a cutoff point.
Yep.
So if you're within a second of the car in front of you at the cutoff point, then when you do get to the DRS sector, even if you fell out of that second, since you were a second back at the cutoff point, you can activate your DRS.
So-
and the same goes for if you pass them before the DRS
still get
sector,
it.
you still get the DRS. So not only are you looking at them and waving as you go by, you are flying down this track, and there is nothing they can do. What's up, everybody? This is Jeremiah, co-host of Turn 1. We're going to get right back to this week's episode, but first I want to let you know where you can go to find us. So you can watch our podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Turn 1 Podcast. If you want to listen to our podcast, you can listen to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Music at Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. If you have any questions, concerns, or suggestions, you can reach out to us at trn1podcast@gmail.com. All right, let's get back to it.
So DRS, drag reduction system, it makes your car hit less air basically as it's going through, and it cuts through the air faster. That's that little flap that opens up like
Right.
you were mentioning. And I know Jeremiah explained a lot there about being within a second, only segments. There is a lot to how that system works. That is not a simple thing to learn how DRS works in a race. So if you didn't get it from that explanation, don't feel bad about it. It's still confusing to us whenever we're either playing the video game or watching the race, and you see somebody, according to the ESPN ticker, they're within a second, yet they don't get DRS activated, and you don't always know why. Maybe they just missed that cutoff barely, or maybe that little ticker's wrong, or something's weird with it. But sometimes you'll see them, like Jeremiah said, they're already passing them, and they open up their wing, and now they're going faster. And there's some math to it, and they always say it during every race that DRS equates to like 19 more kilometers per hour or whatever it is. Whatever it is, it seems really fast.
Yeah, and sometimes it won't open.
Yeah, it's broken.
Sometimes you'll hear them in the communications. They're like, okay, we will not have DRS. We're getting it fixed. Stay with us. I'll get back to you on that. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I guess I just won't have DRS.
I know that I don't know when they implement it, but I know they did it purely for strategic points. They wanted more overtakes in race, and I know that's what the backstory is behind DRS.
I mean, I get it.
People were complaining that Formula One was too boring because once the race got spread out after the first couple of laps, there was no overtaking. But now, if you can get within 1 second of the person in front of you, you are rewarded with going faster for a chance at the overtake. And then it's up to that person in front of you to not give it to you, which makes for a more interesting 90-minute race.
Yeah, I like to think so. I mean, whenever you have one guy who's been following, and let's say, because DRS also doesn't get activated for, I think it's the first 2 or 3 laps.
Yep.
I
Lap
think
3, it kicks on.
Is it 3 or 4?
3.
Okay, so on lap 3, let's say you have the guy in second who's just been sitting here following this guy in first for 3 laps now, or 2 laps now, and the entire time trying to stay within 1 second so that when DRS finally kicks on, he can take full advantage of it.
Okay, I've got one more point for you in terms of F1 basics.
Okay.
Why do they have to stop and change tires? Why can't they just have one tire go the whole race?
They can, but they're not allowed to.
There we go.
So in the FIA regulations, one of the rules that they have set for the drivers and for the teams to follow is that you can't, or you have to use 2 different tire compounds. So let me talk a little bit about tire compounds real quick, just so that they kind of understand. You have 5 different tire compounds, and they're rated from 1 to 5, with I think 5 being the softest and 1 being the hardest. On any given race weekend, they're only allowed to bring 3 compounds. So if you're choosing 5, 4, and 3, or 1, 2, and 3, That's what you're going to roll with. It has to be what is it? In sequence, right? They can't bring like the 1 tire and then the 4 and the 5.
No, it has to be the 3 that are stacked together for that
right.
weekend.
So 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, whatever. Anyway, one of them is designated as the soft tire, one is the medium, and one is the hard. So if you're bringing 5, 4, and 3, 5 is going to be your soft, 4 is going to be your medium, and 3 is going to be your hard. However, if you're bringing
1, 2,
3,
3.
2, 1, now 3, which is the same exact tire compound, nothing is different from that race to this race, but now 3 is your soft
Instead of the
because
hard.
it's the softest compound of the 3 that you're bringing. And that one confused me.
And it's
for
different
the
than how it
longest.
used to. We won't get too much in how it used to be. There used to be way more.
Oh, you could use all
they
of
had
them.
purple tires and all this
And
other
orange
stuff.
tires
and it
and-
was, they simplified it, but also confused it more if you start looking into it.
That's a good point, actually. I'm going to bring colors into that too. Your soft tire is always red.
Always red.
No matter what compound they're bringing, it's always red. Your medium tire is always yellow, and your hard tire is always going to be white. So when you're looking at the cars as they're going around the track, if you want to know what tire they have, you can look and you'll see a ring on the outside of the tire, a thin striped ring that goes around the outskirts of the tire, and that's either white, yellow, or red.
Yep. Okay, so that was a little bit of F1 basics. I want to wrap this particular topic up with just some F1 terminology. Some of it we've already used. I'll spit these out. If you would like to describe it, you can. Otherwise, I can. What's a paddock?
So the paddock is where all of the garages are. It's
Right.
where you have all of the different team garages, and it's the area where there's a behind the garages where
It's
it's
not
just like,
necessarily the pits. It's the garage and behind.
right. So it's that area behind the garages and the actual garages itself. It's not the actual pit lane itself.
Right. So we got the paddock, which is just where the teams are hanging out, where all their stuff is. You'll see these giant buildings built on race day that are all in the team's colors and
Yeah,
look real
that
cool.
are packed up and gone by
a
Sunday
day.
afternoon.
It's crazy how they move all the other. Okay, so what is the pit or the box?
So it depends on what you follow. I think here in America, we call it pits with NASCAR and IndyCar, but over in Europe, they call it the box. And so when you're watching a driver's going around on a race day and you'll hear the communication, the team will come on the radio and they'll go box, 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 box. That's him telling him to enter the pits. That's
Right.
what that is. He's telling him, hey, come in. We either have some kind of mechanical issue that we have to fix or we need to replace the tires. It's one or the other.
Sure. We mentioned lights out already. That just means the start of the race. That doesn't mean power has failed on the track or something has gone wrong. That means that the 5 red lights over the drivers have gone out, and that means the race is going. There is no green light to start a race. It is the lights going away that starts the race.
It's red, 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 off.
Yep, and
then
that's
there we go.
That's you go. I'll do this one. You do the next one. The apex.
Okay.
So if you hear them saying, "Oh, he's going too fast in that apex," or he's not coming out of it fast enough, that is the most center or most severe point of any corner or turn, right? So you're talking about where have you reached the maximum point of that turn, and now you're coming out of it.
But it's always the inside of the turn,
Right.
correct?
I guess, but I guess it could be on the track, maybe.
Because I feel like whenever we're watching them go around and
They're trying to cut it.
yeah, they're going towards the apex and they're
Right.
not going towards the outside of
No,
the
no.
turn. They want to get down and deep, so
It's
they come towards the
fastest point, but also the sharpest point of
Right.
the turn. And that's where you want to break into that and then accelerate out of it. And you'll see sometimes drivers they'll have commented that, oh, he's losing speed in that turn. It's because that driver hasn't figured out how to get in and out of that turn yet. What's a chicane?
center. So a chicane, since we looked it up to get the official definition, it's a set of sharp turns that go in different directions.
Alternating
directions.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say that you have a section of the track where you have a hard left followed by a hard right. That's considered a chicane.
Right. And I think there's probably a ton of examples of this, but if you go look at the British Grand Prix Silverstone, I think it's the middle of Sector 2, has a crazy chicane that is really hard to get on the F1 video game.
Yeah, I think my favorite chicane though has got to be COTA, Circuit of the Americas in Austin.
Because they have like 2 back-to-back.
Dude, and it's wild because they're coming in out of the last turn at full speed, and then they take the first turn at full speed. But if they want to be able to make turn 2 and 3 of that chicane, they have to lift off.
Yep.
So you'll hear them like, "Wah!" at the end of the chicane.
And I think Suzuka Circuit in Japan has that crazy like 3 sets of 3 chicanes in Sector 1 as it goes up that hill and around the bend. That is wild. Okay, a couple more. Parc Ferme.
So Parc Ferme, like we said earlier whenever we're talking qualifying, when you start qualifying, not when you finish qualifying, when you start qualifying, whatever you have your car set up as, that's it for the rest of the race weekend. So you can only make your changes in the practice sessions and before qualifying starts. Because once that qualifying timer starts and you actually have the countdown and everything matters, you enter what's called Parc Ferme. And that means no more changes.
So basically, you can't run a different package for qualifying versus race day. When you qualify, you're showing everybody else what you're bringing to the table.
Pretty
much. They're showing you. You can't show up with an entirely different car on race day and mix things up. All right, final one, degradation. You'll hear this a lot midway through most races.
Okay. You want me to go into it?
Yeah, please.
So degradation is used more in terms of tires. Right. So you have what's called tire degradation. And tire degradation is as you do more and more laps, that rubber is going to start to burn off. It's going to start to warp. It's going to start to puddle up on the ends of the tires. Whatever it does, it lessens the life of the tire. You're now not going to be able to have as much grip. You're not going to be able to go as fast. And the tire is degrading over time, which is why it's called tire degradation.
And even though the teams are using the same tires, they experience different degradation based on how their cars are built and set up for that race day.
The perfect example of that, Ferrari versus Red Bull in any race of 2022. Right. Ferrari could go at most on those soft tires like 5-6 laps, and then everything starts to go downhill.
But Red Bull would go 20 laps.
Yeah. Meanwhile, and more specifically, Sergio Perez, with his ability to make those tires last however long he wants. I genuinely believe that Sergio Perez, if the FIA rules allowed, could go an entire race on softs.
Probably could. Well, there was that one race that Alex Albon in Australia did 50 out of 51 laps on softs.
And on the very last lap, he pit for the
So you'll see that it's a whole other episode. We cannot get into strategy on F1 basics, but strategy is a huge part of F1, and that's why in the middle of the race you start having all of these pit stops because that's when they have to switch to do their next tire compound. And you'll see some teams start on the softer compound, some start on the medium, some on the harder. And that's where all this strategy comes into play.
Oh, yeah. You'll see guys trying to pit a lap earlier than the car in front of him. That's because he wants to get on those fast tires sooner so that he can make up ground while that guy's still going the rest of his lap on those old tires. Therefore, by the time the guy in front gets to the pits, you now have made up so much ground because you're going faster that when he exits, he's now behind you.
And the worst case scenario is when teams... It goes one of two ways, but they start on the hard tires because they're like, oh, we're going to go deep into this race on this one tire set, then switch to softs at the end and go fast. And those hard tires last like 10 laps.
Yeah, they realize, hey, man, we're getting past a lot.
Because not only are the harder tires slower than the softer tires, they're supposed to last longer. But again, if your car isn't set up right, they don't.
Or sometimes the track, like if the weather isn't permitting for those specific needs for those tires, the hard tires won't have a good day. And you'll hear guys talking about that in the race. Like they'll say, Charles just came out, like, so say Max is talking to his engineer and he's like, oh, Charles just came out on the hards. He's whatever time slower, half a second slower. And Max is like, I think we'll go to mediums.
So just to wrap up F1 basics, I'll cover kind of the list that we did real quick. So if you have never watched or listened to or understand anything about F1, here's what you need to know. 10 teams, 20 drivers. There's 20-something races that last 90 minutes, and the drivers get points and the teams get points.
Pretty much. I feel like the only thing, but without getting too deep into it, into the rules and everything, the only thing that we can really add to that is you have a yellow flag and a red flag. Right. Red flag means the race is now on hold. Everybody enters the pits. You're off the track. And that's typically if they have to clean a lot of debris, if there's a rain delay, something like that. That's massive. That's going to take a time suck. And then you have the yellow flag, and a safety car usually comes out when you have the yellow flag. All the cars slow down, line up behind the yellow flag or behind the safety car, and they go around for however many laps it takes to clean up this small incident that's out there, whether it's a wreck or debris or I don't know, a goat ran onto the track. Whatever.
If you're watching a race, safety cars aren't uncommon. There's usually, I'd say they probably average one a race.
I think that's almost a guarantee.
It is a huge strategy game changer because if you're that driver that is 20 to 30 seconds ahead of the rest of the pack in first place, safety car neutralizes that advantage. You're now right back. You're still in the front,
Right.
but you are now right back with everybody else.
Yeah, another big thing with that too is if you've been making a set of tires stretch for way longer than you should have, way longer, then sometimes the safety car or yellow flag will allow you the opportunity to get a free pit stop, because now the majority of people are going to pit, or the people that are so far behind you who also have to slow down, it's going to take them so long to catch up to that safety car. You can just pull on in and get a fresh set of softs.
So if you're watching the race and you see a yellow flag and a safety car, don't think that it's boring. It might last 3, 4, 5 laps, but the race is about to be a whole lot more interesting when when the safety car gets off.
And those restarts can get dicey, because you'll hear this a lot whenever you're watching the races. Drivers complain about these safety cars. They do not go fast enough to keep the tires warm on these F1 cars. I mean, they can't.
There we go. All right, F1 basics.